I was sort of careful to find people who aren't currently in government so that we could have a truly candid conversation. And these are people who are real experts on these issues, I have learned a ton from each of them, and they contributed in ways they don't even know to the paper and to the recommendations. Starting on my right, Christy Peel is the executive director of the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. The center really focuses on promoting and enabling low-income and moderate-income, middle-income homeownership in New York. And as part of that, has been very involved in both support for the foreclosure crisis and then also in Sandy and Sandy recovery. And Christy has been in affordable housing in various realms and supportive housing for over 20 years. Next to Christy is Terry Brody. He is now the Senior Managing Director at Ancora Consulting Group. He also helped establish the New Jersey Governor's Office of Rebuilding and Recovery and was the Executive Director for a period of time there as well. And we worked very closely together when I was at HUD. Next to Terry is Brad Gare. He is currently the Executive Emergency Manager for Witt O'Brien's, has 20 years of disaster experience. He's worked for New York City in various realms, including after Sandy, and also has worked at FEMA. And then Marion McFadden. Marion is now the Vice President of Policy at Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national not-for-profit that works to improve communities, primarily by investing in affordable housing. And she had many roles at HUD, including being the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs. So she oversaw the CDBG-DR program, among other grant programs, during the latter half of the Obama administration. She was also part of the President's Sandy Task Force, and she was a senior advisor to Secretary Donovan during the task force in helping shape the Sandy program, and also has worked on past disasters, including Katrina and 9/11. So has a lot of expertise. So clearly a qualified panel to start talking about this. I want to just start by asking same question I asked of the borough president and Raphael, which is if I could just give you guys a few minutes to talk about one or two recommendations that particularly resonated with your experiences. And I'll start with Christy, and we can just kind of go down the line.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you for this amazing, incredibly thoughtful paper. Thanks to CPC and the Borough President for sponsoring it. It's really amazing to have the opportunity to stop. For those of us still working in the recovery, it's not over yet, but to stop for a moment and think back about what happened back in 2012 and 2013 as we were trying to come together to craft a holistic response here in New York City. So just a bit about the center. As Holly mentioned, we were founded in 2008 as a response to the foreclosure crisis. We spent a lot of time helping folks modify mortgages with their banks at the height of the economic crisis. A lot of the neighborhoods where we were working not only were hit by predatory lending, then foreclosure, the economic crisis, but during Sandy they got pummeled with flooding and really serious physical and financial damage. So our work on the recovery began right after the storm. We started fundraising to get money out to homeowners directly, and then to work on getting funding for grants to providers. Our model is to work with groups that are on the ground. We work with housing counseling and legal services providers throughout the city and the state, in fact. And our groups had really great subject matter expertise. They had connections in these communities, and they had the ability to move into communities with this subject matter expertise where they hadn't previously had a footprint. So our folks were on the ground within a week, I would say, talking to folks about what FEMA was, how to get insurance payments from your typical homeowner insurance, how to start navigating that mess. And we really wanted to get our our subject matter experts up to speed on the critical programs around disaster recovery. So through that work, we did grant making, we did training, we did coordinating. We rolled out, I would say, about 7 programs over the past 5 years, both independently in partnership with government and with private philanthropy. So it's really been an incredibly comprehensive approach, but one of the first lessons that we've learned is that you have to continually go to your toolbox for a new tool, right? There's never one tool that's going to work. You have to continually modify what you're working with to try and deal with evolving issues. But I just wanted to amplify something the borough president was saying. Right after the storm, we went down to the Gulf and we talked to folks that had designed programs in Mississippi and as well as in Louisiana. And one of the things that we had heard was that folks down there who had gone through Katrina were now going through the foreclosure crisis, right? And there was this connectivity between homeowner issues, between disaster and foreclosure. And so it was really emphasized to us that having consumer advocates fully integrated in a disaster response program was incredibly critical, and obviously we agreed with that approach. And it's something that we really pushed for early on. Ultimately, I think we've developed a really great relationship with the city through the Build It Back program. We're actually a contractor, as well as doing a lot of work with the state and other responses as well. And we've been able to really live, I think, Holly's recommendation of incorporating case management into disaster recovery and the importance of communication, outreach, and using on-the-ground work. But I think we knew a lot of the things then that we know now, and I would love to just kind of frame our conversation around how do we not make the mistakes again, right? I was looking at our comment letter that we sent to the city on their CDBG action plan, and a lot of the things that are in there are in my remarks today. So the question is, how come we weren't able to act on those recommendations? Not just that these are great recommendations, but we have to kind of make a commitment to actually act on them in the future. So that means integrating the case management with disaster case management. There are kind of 5 different systems to help homeowners. There was the CAN network, there are the VOADs, there were our counselors, there were the actual case managers within Build It Back. And it took us a long time to really integrate all those different streams of services. But I think making a huge commitment to sort of a whole family approach is it really comes out of your recommendation around the case management approach. Making sure that we're looking at people as people and not as products, right? It's very hard to put people through a production program because people have complex lives that evolve and change, get more complicated over time during the recovery. And people's financial situations in year 4 are usually going to be much worse than they were in the first year, right? So if you are eligible for a buyback in year 1, you might be 2 years behind in your mortgage in year 3. So whatever value you could have gotten at that point is going to be really different at that stage in time. So I'll probably come back to some of the other thoughts about the recommendations around case management, but I really want to think about how we can, as you said, this afternoon, make sure that we are really honest about why we weren't able to act on the recommendations, why we weren't able to more fully integrate a whole case management approach. Some of it is based on the CDBG regulations. I think some of it is that after a disaster, we're all really freaked out. 30,000 people were impacted, and the the instinct is to rely on people that know disaster, and that's what we ended up calling the disaster industrial complex.
All right, I think you've laid some groundwork and a lot of questions that we need to deal with. I think your question of why didn't we get it better this time is one that resonates with a lot of us, and particularly with a lot of the community groups, some of whom asked questions earlier as well, who were really on the ground right after Sandy. So we'll come back to a lot of that, but Terry, I just want to go and kind of start with your immediate reactions to 1 or 2 things. And
Sure, thank you, Holly. I think anyone who lived through Sandy and was involved in the recovery and had a chance to read Holly's paper really, shows that she really had her finger on the pulse in terms of, what were the significant issues impacting this entire region that was going through the process. And really, I think so many of the recommendations resonated with me for being on the other side of the river in New Jersey. The one I think that's so foundational, though, is building a central recovery office. When we were just weeks after the storm, debris was still on our streets, the power was still out, evacuation orders were still in place. We had to tackle, how do we want to approach the long-term recovery process? And like Christy and like the borough president, we spoke with Gulf Coast states who've been through this before. We spoke with Plain states, a lot of different states and municipalities that have been through this before. And what we saw was there was really no one-size-fits-all approach. Everybody tackled it differently. But for us, we ultimately moved away from going with building a new bureaucracy, a big bureaucracy, because we're really blessed with having so many talented individuals at our state agencies and departments. And it just didn't make sense to us to pluck them out of those places where they have resources already in place. So instead, we built a relatively small recovery office that was housed in the governor's office. And we basically coordinated the recovery of all those different departments and agencies. And I think what that really allowed us to do was to develop a both holistic and a coordinated recovery plan, working across all those different departments and agencies. And I should also mention local government, federal government as well. And it also allowed for very quick decision-making. We worked directly with our cabinet members. They developed in-depth work plans. They ran those by us. We discussed those with the governor, and we got direction, and then we went to implementation. And I think that was a really efficient and productive model that helped avoid duplication, redundancy, and everybody was essentially rowing in the same direction, which I think was great. One thing that Holly definitely mentioned, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about is procurement. We call procurement the third rail of recovery at the state level. The state procurement rules, much like the federal rules, are somewhat draconian, overly bureaucratic.
Do you want to just explain quickly what procurement is?
Sure. So you're doing things like you need to bring in contractors to remove the debris, and the debris we had was almost unprecedented in New Jersey, so we couldn't handle it ourselves. How do you procure companies to do this within days? Under the current procurement rules, it's virtually impossible. But obviously you can't allow debris just to line our streets because that's going to delay long-term recovery. So there are ways around it, things like sole source, cooperative purchase agreements, task order contracts, and things like that. And so we had to be really creative, but we're also dealing with a procurement bureau, which is overseeing the entire state's procurement process. And so it's an overly taxed organization to begin with, and then they got this thrust on them. And so even though we were able to find some relatively creative ways to do things quickly, parenthetically, the normal procurement process often takes a year or more in state government. The ironic thing is, at the end of the day, you get criticized because you shouldn't have done this as a sole source, or you shouldn't have, and then the Inspector General's office comes in and Monday morning quarterbacks everything that you did. So I can't say I have all the answers. I think that unfortunately legislation is needed to really address that, to allow some things we did once things sort of calmed down a little bit in the recovery. We did full-blown RFPs to have things like debris removal contractors in place for the next disaster. But candidly, you don't get the same level of interest when you do an RFP for some hypothetical job down the road. So there's really no silver bullet, but it's really something that it needs to be addressed. One final thing I just want to talk about was the infrastructure projects and the need for coordination both at the federal level and at the state level. And I think, as Holly mentioned, the coordination team that Holly and Irene and others put together was really, really key to helping move forward some real critical infrastructure projects. That being said, we can only do so much with the current legislative frameworks. And I think her proposal is to allow, particularly where you have multiple federal funding partners involved in a project, to allow the main funding partners' rules and regulations to essentially override the other funding partners is a really important one that I'd like to see implemented at the federal level. Anecdotally, we had one fairly large infrastructure project, that building a revetment in northern Atlantic City to help protect against future storm surge, that involved 3 different federal funding agencies. We had FEMA, HUD, and the Army Corps of Engineers, each of which had their own unique and sometimes contradictory rules on things like prevailing wage, environmental reviews, disadvantaged business requirements, and things like that. And it got to the point where the project almost couldn't move forward because it was so hard to harmonize all 3 federal agencies, notwithstanding all the attempts that the federal partners made to try to get it to work. Ultimately, it did work, but it caused many sleepless nights over a period of, over a year, actually. So I think that's really one that really resonated with us.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Brad?
I've been doing this for a long time. Maybe I'm the only one here that does this professionally all the time. And I can tell you that all 41 of your recommendations resonated with me because I could take those recommendations back in time with me to Hurricane Floyd in eastern North Carolina in 1999, and the exact same recommendations in one form or another would or could have or probably did come out. I could have taken them with me to Florida after the hurricanes in 2004, where there were 5 hurricanes and 15,000, 20,000 families out of their homes. And the same recommendations could have come out of that disaster. I definitely could have taken them to Hurricane Katrina, where I was FEMA's post-disaster housing recovery leader of an agency that had no post-disaster housing recovery plan. And between the FEMA funds and the HUD funds and all the other SBA and all the others, your same 41 recommendations would have resonated there as well. And we can package them up right now and send them to North Carolina for the people after Hurricane Matthew, or to Baton Rouge for the people who had floods there last summer, or we could just put them in a time capsule and wait for the next one, because nothing's changing. Nothing's changing. Jim, I remember when you asked me about going down to New Orleans, and you took me aside and said, do I really need to go? And I said, you do really need to go, but I didn't entirely tell you why you really need to go, and I didn't want to bias you in that, but I wanted you to go to see what was going to happen to you, regardless of your best efforts. Because until something changes, we're going to keep getting this. After Katrina, Congress passed the Post-Katrina Reform Act, and it didn't reform anything. After Hurricane Sandy, we had the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. It didn't improve anything. I was on the Sean Donovan-led panel task force that came up with 60-plus resilience recommendations. They didn't do anything to help us here. They were well-intentioned. It was 20-plus federal agencies, so you get what you get when you put 20-plus federal agencies together and ask them to come up with recommendations they can all agree upon. We've got to make some substantive changes here. This recovery was a disaster. We failed the people of New York. I'm talking from the city perspective. My team is here, Rob is here, and Patrick is here, and Thaddeus is here. They worked hard. Everybody worked hard at this. I agree with you completely, Holly, that there are no villains. But I will tell you, we did a damn good job of breaking some people who tried to be heroes. And one of them's right there. And there are others in this room. With the bureaucracy, we've got to demand change. We can't settle for this. And the problem is, what are we trying to do here? We talk about post-disaster housing, but have we ever had the discussion of, do people who lost their houses because of disaster, are they entitled to a new home at the government's expense? I'm not saying yes or no. I'm saying we haven't talked about that. Until you talk about that, you get what you get. You get FEMA coming in saying, we're not here to make you whole. We'll give you 30 grand to get you on your way, but we're not going to make you whole. we get Congress saying, maybe we'll pass some legislation and throw some money in and then let state and local governments figure out how to build housing programs around that. But are people entitled to a home? We know they're not. There are tens of thousands of families in this city that don't have a home, and we acknowledge that. We have people who lose their homes all the time because of their own personal disasters, and we don't feel like they're entitled to a home. If we feel like people after disaster are, then we need to build programs that get them into a home, and not programs that are really set up to pass a bunch of money around and eventually get some people back in a home if you can figure out your way through the process. So, 41 brilliant recommendations. I wish you had given those to Sean Donovan when he was still at HUD and could have done something about them, because these are not surprises, but they're actually very well articulated. And I hope this does work up through the bureaucracy so that we can see some change for the next ones.
Thank you. Okay, lots of food for thought there. Marion?
So I have been working on disaster recovery since 9/11, and I absolutely agree that the recommendations are all brilliant, and many of them could have been said many years ago, but I would absolutely say we've made a ton of progress. Recoveries are getting better, but they are not anywhere near what they need to be. Don't have to tell anyone in this region that it is too slow. So the recommendations that resonate with me the most, Holly, are about getting it to move more quickly, to take the fog out of the recovery process so that individuals can understand. I love the common application idea. It's beneficial not just to individuals who are trying to get assistance, but to the many agencies that are trying to administer it. Has the added benefit of trying to prevent fraud, which we know Congress will love. To take on that question from Raphael about what does Congress really want, I know they want the same things that we want. They want a good recovery with checks and balances. I know this because I've spent lots of time hearing from senators and members of Congress, Senator Schumer, Senator Menendez, Representative Velasquez, and Pallone and Pascrell were all over us at the federal government, pushing us, saying, we gave you flexibility, why can't you use it? And sometimes the answer is, well, you didn't give us enough flexibility, or we don't have enough staff, or sometimes there's too much gray area. So cleaning up that gray area would make a huge difference, including giving HUD the permanent authority for disaster recovery funding. Because that $30,000 from FEMA is only going to take you so far. We need to answer this question. If a homeowner or a small business owner gets a loan, can they pay it off or not pay it off with CDBG? And that's varied over time because it's a hard policy question. On the one hand, whether you call it your inner Republican, Holly, or just sort of good sense, why should the taxpayer somewhere way out there pay for a homeowner who was living in a more dangerous place that got hit, right? That's more the mentality of like, we shouldn't put this on everyone. On the other hand, what is the point of a strong centralized federal government if not to help people when they're most in need? And at the individual level, it's really frustrating if you're a credit-worthy, tax-paying individual and you take a loan to get your house fixed up. You're going to be pretty angry when your neighbor who was rejected for a loan or didn't apply for a loan doesn't take one and then gets a debt-free recovery. So those are some tough questions that I think we should answer in peacetime instead of when the politics are all swept in. And then the other thing I would say is how grateful I am that you took on this question of rental assistance, because I haven't seen a recovery yet where renters were the priority, where the people with the greatest needs took on the greatest priority. And I think that's just a political reality, that the people who are renting homes are less likely to be politically engaged. I think it's about race, and I think it's about class. And having designated authorities for rental programs is one way to address that. So whether that's providing additional housing choice vouchers and giving additional authority for the low-income housing tax credit to build new units, or designating within CDBG how much of that money should go to rental assistance. I think that's really important. Here in New York City, if 70% of your residents are renters, why so much focus on the home ownership? And then the last one for me is your look at mitigation, resilience, preparedness. I think that that's some of the greatest work coming out of Hurricane Sandy. It's the innovations at the federal, state, and local level, working with philanthropy to try to look at, when we're rebuilding, how can we not just keep people and property safe, but how can we make better community spaces? How can we address all of the community's needs? So we're not just throwing good money after bad, but we're not missing opportunities to make communities more livable. And part of the excitement about that work for me is that it's moved outside of the disaster space. Cities and other planners around the country are talking about resilience in everything they do. And that's, I think, attributable to the Hurricane Sandy recovery, starting with the president and moving out from there, that emphasis on resilience.
I do think one of the gratifying things that you see now is in a place like the New York region. I mean, I visited a Republican town manager from a little Long Island town, and he was talking to me about how great bioswales were. And I sort of had one of those aha moments of, this is good. This is, if we are getting out to people who would never have thought about things like resilience, and they're starting to realize that they have to take some of that on, that's huge. But again, the question is, how do we get that happening at a larger scale, in places where they haven't had a disaster yet? But also, interestingly, one of the things we're seeing is how quickly people forget. Even when we did a bunch of infrastructure projects and provided a ton of money for a few infrastructure resilience projects, including one in Hoboken, everybody after Hoboken, massive flooding, give us some protection from the surge. And then when we went back and started talking to them about the decorative seawall that was going to come in, people freaked out. We don't want our views impeded. Their memories are short. And so I think a lot of this, while seeing that planning work happening, there needs to be incredible leadership to keep people focused on that and to prioritize that. I want to follow up on this question of, both, well, I would say Christy, Brad, and Marion kind of all hit on this question of these big policy questions. Why isn't this happening? I mean, what would be the way, who would have to be those people in the room? What would you do if you were, the king of the world, to get these things moved forward in a meaningful way, to make this not just another set of good recommendations on a shelf? What really are the steps that have to happen from your perspectives? Can I ask you to share,
Yeah.
Terry, so I can jump in? Thanks.
I think there are some, incremental changes that you can make on the federal level in terms of how you implement on a local level. Putting an emphasis on engaging local groups and a real priority, I think is really critical, and training local groups on how to be a participant in a CDBG or a federally funded disaster program, I think is easier than training a consultant from another part of the country on what it means to work in Sheepshead Bay or parts of Staten Island. So I think that local, the premium on the local knowledge can be incorporated into a procurement process where you say, we want a demonstrated ability to have the right language capacity for Bensonhurst and be able to engage with folks. But I think that the challenge we have is that we kind of lost a critical moment, right? So a lot of the folks that we're trying to engage around resiliency might have seen their neighbor impacted by flooding, but they weren't. So now they've moved on to other challenges. And it's not necessarily that they don't want the decorative seawall, it's just they've focused on other issues now, and the moment that we had to get people to take action was right after the crisis. So it's both doing the planning, as you said, in anticipation, but also knowing that you have a critical moment in time to get people to make commitments and changes to do things differently. So I don't know whether that is driven by a timing piece on a regulatory level or how to kind of make that happen, but I think putting the emphasis on both the local decision-making, really driven down to the community level, which you can do through your own processes, and then also creating some timelines around the decisions around the future resiliency right afterwards. I'm not as much of an expert on sort of how that's driven down from the federal level, but I think we could do that locally.
So Holly, I think we kind of bifurcate between what requires a legislative solution and what can we do today. I'll let Marion talk about the legislative solutions because she's definitely much more involved in that, and I think that they're definitely are lessons to be learned there. But in terms of what we can do today, I thought your recommendation on really trying to pull together everything that we did in this disaster and prior disasters, and Brad kind of touched upon this, and build much more in-depth decision trees and toolkits where you can say, all right, is this a disaster that impacted the housing sector? If the answer is yes, did it impact, single-family homes? Did it impact large multifamily homes? Yes, yes. And then you kind of go down that decision tree, that workflow. And, here are different ways that, single-family home recoveries have worked in the past. We have state-run programs, contractor-run programs. You have resident-run programs. You have everything in between. Here's the pros and cons. And in fact, here's policies and procedures on how you can actually develop this program. Again, not to be prescriptive, which you said in your opening remarks, but more just to be helpful in terms of showing what has worked in the past. And I think when you overlay that with the technical assistance, which the HUD folks are always willing to provide, but to really sit down and walk through that decision tree together and talk about lessons learned and what makes the most sense for your impacted jurisdiction. I think that's something that you can do in relatively short order with hopefully not too much of a heavy lift.
And is that getting the current Marion at HUD to get a little bit of funding to bring in Terry Brody and Brad Gare and Marion McFadden to try to really get in a room and hash that out? How do you see that, even just that HUD piece of what HUD can do to better prepare future grantees? Is that realistic? Do we think that's something that could happen?
I think you would need to augment the current staff. We know they are tireless public servants at HUD, and they have a lot on their plates. Post-disaster and their pre-disaster work as well. So I think you'd really need to bring in some extra staff, whether you work with the nonprofit community, which has a lot of great ideas, and you use them as a convener to bring together people in government, people who were in government, people in the consultancy, and bring together all those different perspectives. But it's definitely, to your point, it's going to require staff, it's going to require money, and it's going to require some time.
After 9/11, I was the federal government's federal recovery officer, so coordinating the $21 billion package that President Bush made available, including the $8.8 billion that FEMA got. And the first thing everyone said was, we need a new law for how we're going to help New York City and recover from 9/11, because the Stafford Act, which is FEMA's governing legislation, was made for natural disasters, not for terrorist attacks. And we thought about that, and then we went back and read the Stafford Act, which is, I would encourage people to do. It's really not that hard to read. Basically, all it says is the president can order any federal agency, with or without compensation, to do anything to help communities recover. And so then you build a lot of regulations around that, but if you peel it back to the actual Stafford Act, that's all it says. And so when FEMA says we can only give you $30,000 for your home, we say, well, maybe we can, so you're saying we can't go in and do repairs on your home with FEMA money in a program called Rapid Repairs. And they say, no, you can do that. So $650 million later, and I agree it was an imperfect program by self-inflicted wound rather than a program that didn't have a lot of merits to it. But FEMA could do that. And then you say, well, if you can fix homes, why can't you pay to build homes from scratch or rebuild them completely? And FEMA will tell you, if you ask them, well, we do that. We've done it in the Virgin Islands, we've done it in Guam, we've done it in the Dakotas on Native American communities. Okay, so what's different between a Native American community in South Dakota and Staten Island when it comes to building a house? Either you have the authority to do it or you don't, and they do. So, my recommendation is we need to make FEMA do their job. We need to get HUD out of the housing part of disaster recovery, not because they're not capable or willing, but because we need a seamless process. Where it goes wrong is in the sequence of delivery. FEMA comes in, you don't know if you're going to get a special congressional authorization for CDBG, so FEMA says, you get your $30,000, we recommend you apply for an SBA loan, and that's it. And then maybe down the line, Congress will authorize some CDBG-DR. The nicest thing about FEMA, the only thing I enjoyed about working there more than anywhere else I've been, is they don't have any budget issues for disasters. Unlike HUD, which has to have Congress authorize funds for the disaster, FEMA has this huge pot called the Disaster Relief Fund, DRF. And Congress just throws a few $1 billion in it every time the pot gets low, and then FEMA spends that on all the disasters, and when the pot gets low again, they throw it in again. So when people would always ask me when I'd come out to disaster, they'd say, does FEMA have enough money for this disaster? And we'd say, we have enough money for every disaster because it's not disaster specific. So my recommendation is that the federal agencies get together, create one post-disaster housing program, put it under FEMA, authorize it through the Disaster Relief Fund, and make that work. And there's a lot of movement right now in thinking about things like that. They're talking about moving the program that the federal government has that funds wildfire fighting under the Disaster Relief Fund for the same idea. One seamless fund that you can use to do anything you need to get the people back into their homes.
It's interesting. So I don't disagree about getting HUD out of housing, oddly enough. But it's interesting to me that you think of FEMA rather than SBA. How do you then integrate the loan element with what FEMA is doing?
I mean, that's one thing that works well already, is you go to FEMA, they give you some assistance. If you want more assistance, and if you're qualified for a loan, you have to go to the SBA before you can get more assistance. So that part really works just fine right now. Where it gets screwed up is if you then get CDBG-DR after that, and then people say, well, why did I take this loan if there's a grant? And the answer is, well, FEMA didn't know when they told you to go to the SBA that there was going to be that, because they didn't know that Congress was going to authorize it. So I think it can still work like that. I think those three agencies can still work hand in hand, but it all has to go through FEMA. And I say it has to go through FEMA because that's what their business is. They're in the business of emergency management. The Small Business Administration, by their name, is not involved in anything having to do with disasters, but they're good at writing loans, so let them do that. HUD is good at housing, not necessarily from funding it in disasters, but in helping with housing and economic development and other things. So let them support that, but put it all in one program. You get into these duplication of benefits that you talked about in your paper. The reason you have a duplication of benefits is because all the benefits aren't available at once. So FEMA gives you some money, and then before HUD gives you any money, they want to know what you did with the FEMA money, and with your insurance money, and with any other money you got. Well, if it all was happening at once, you wouldn't have that problem. You'd have one inspection. Jim, how many times did people go out and look at these different houses? I had one gentleman tell me that he'd had first the city building department, then the FEMA inspector, the SBA, their insurance adjusters, build it back 3 or 4 times. And he said, not for nothing, but it's still the same vacant lot where the house was destroyed and washed away on day 1, but they all kept looking at it. You've got to centralize it, one centralized process, one centralized funding. Back to my original point, do people are the people entitled to another house? That's a separate issue. But if they are, then put it all in one program and make it all happen. Pull on the expertise of other federal agencies, but make FEMA do their job. FEMA kind of loves the program the way it is now because it's so easy to just say, all we have is $30,000. Doesn't matter if you're in Kansas or the Gulf Coast or in New York City. We don't care about the cost of living. You get $30,000 wherever you are. It's a little more than that now because it's pegged to the CPI, but that's it. It's a very easy program to administer. And what always surprises me is that people accept it. Jim, did you ever think of saying, that's ridiculous, $30,000 doesn't do anything in New York City? Everybody just sort of accepts that as a fact and says, okay, that's the way the program works, that's it. That number was set at $20,000, 15 years ago, and it just grows and nobody ever says anything about is it the right thing?
Marion.
So back to HUD for a second.
I think we just extricated HUD entirely from disaster. That was nice.
I would argue HUD does have a role because HUD is uniquely concerned about poor people. That's not the strength of the SBA or FEMA. FEMA actually has in the Stafford Act a prohibition on considering economic status for assistance, so hasn't gained that expertise in understanding the needs of the most vulnerable populations, including the homeless. So I'm not getting on board with take it out of HUD's hands entirely. However, CDBG-DR does give HUD a lot of flexibility. I don't think HUD's ever received one comment letter after Congress passes a law about how it should write the rules. So unlike regular HUD programs, there's no notice and public comment rulemaking. HUD just takes the pen and changes it from last time. Some of the most fun we get to have because you can look back and say what was broken, but the public's not weighing in. That's a key part of the process that gets missed because of the need to go more quickly. But I think that's something that HUD started to look at the end of the Obama administration, and for the first time did some limited consultation with grantees and nonprofits about what could be done better. But I think that's a key component that people need to be aware of. It's certainly something I would expect in my current capacity in a nonprofit that will be weighing in on future disasters.
I mean, obviously, though, if there's no standing authority, you're going to sacrifice speed if you have a public comment period, which maybe gets back to the point of HUD, this needs to become a standing program, have one massive public period for getting that right and start standardizing those things.
I really strongly agree with that, Holly, and the reason is, you're right, HUD's CDBG-DR is so flexible, but from a housing perspective, at the end of the day, I would trade a lot of that flexibility for some standard programs, because all you can do at the end of the day to a house is buy it, build it from scratch, fix it, or elevate it. There aren't that many choices. So the flexibility, I'll take on the other side for some of the economic development things and resilience and some other things, but for getting people back in their houses, I don't really need that much flexibility. I'd love to have a standing program, get the money in the people's hands, get them some help with getting their houses rebuilt, and get out of the business.
And if given a choice, I think a lot of residents that went through Sandy would prefer ultimately to have a grant from CDBG than a loan from SBA. I mean, we spent a lot of time resolving SBA loan issues. I think we had to get 3,000 loans canceled. So I don't know how effective the SBA loan program is in actually doing its job to get people money when they need it. A lot of folks don't want to take on additional debt. They don't have increased income at that point in time. They usually have a mortgage. They might be paying rent as well as their mortgage at that point. So the SBA loan is not something that I think people are very married or committed to from an impacted resident perspective.
I should just clarify, in talking about the SBA taking it on, they would obviously have to have increased authority to do grants and forgivable loans also. With the only kind of benefit I see of having that at SBA is that if you have one agency with a loan, and by the way, I do think people should take loans if they have the ability to take the loans so that the grant money goes further. But if they hit hardship, if it's at one agency, does that make it easier for them to shift into a grant or forgivable loan as opposed to having SBA only looking at things from a loan lens, and then you have to go deal with another agency where you can't necessarily apply for a grant at that point?
I think having it focused on the housing at HUD is ultimately a better choice, again, if we had to make one. And if there was a way to integrate the loan piece in a CDBG response, even better, because then you can start to do the holistic community planning that Beth was talking about, as opposed to an income-driven one, right? I think it's very important to focus the resources towards lower-income populations, but when you're looking at a community planning effort, there might be somebody living next door who's $1 plus over the income limit, right? And the loan gives you the ability to do that. But SBA has no presence in the city, really, for most, residents. They don't, unless they're a business owner, they don't have a relationship there. It doesn't mean anything. If they have issues, it's very difficult to resolve it. So I don't see, from a sort of a community resident perspective, the benefit of keeping them involved just to get the loan capacity, right? There are other ways that you could do the lending.
Marion, did we cut you off before you had?
What we really need is a congressional champion or a set of congressional champions who want to take this on. Traditionally, there are no wins in disaster recovery, so this is something that people are wise to stay far, far away from, right? You don't make your career on being the tough guy who's reining in spending on disaster recovery, only to get blasted in the press by all the people who need help who don't get it. White houses don't tend to want to be deeply involved in FEMA work. They tend to give the FEMA administrator a lot of flexibility and distance. I think that you have raised so many important questions at the federal level that they need to start with Congress. And Congress isn't going to read this paper unless somebody gets it to them and really focuses them on it. And so I would say that's on all of us to talk to our delegations and to raise these issues, because the next one's coming and we're all going to pay for it, right? Looking at the flood insurance reauthorization that's going on now, some communities are saying, why should I care? Well, you're paying for it. You're paying for it. So let's spend the money more wisely and hope that we spend less of it.
And that's the opportunity, right, is that people are looking at the flood insurance reauthorization within the next 2 months. So we have an opportunity to get these recommendations out there now with our local reps and say this is really critical. And it has to be a component piece, right? It can't just be NFIP and then CDBG. It has to be a holistic response.
Yeah, I think a lot of the questions that got raised, I'm trying to imagine, Marion, how things like Brad's question of, should we be giving people homes after a disaster? Or is the CDBG-DR program, should that really be for low and moderate income like other HUD programs, or should that just be flexible disaster money? How does Congress engage in that? I mean, I'm thinking about Terry's point, which I thought was a good one of, yeah, HUD probably can't be the one that's going to convene all the people and make this decision tree, but it can be a presence where a strong not-for-profit that can convene those people pulls it together and does a lot of the legwork to get that product. Is there something similar that would get Congress engaged on some of those hard questions? What does that look like? I don't think it looks like Chuck Schumer having a philosophical meeting with a bunch of his peers, right? Or does it?
I think that'd be a great place to start. I think the Senate Minority Leader is a great place to start, who's lived through it. I would say he is personally responsible for one of the better innovations to come out of Sandy, which you mentioned in passing, which is allowing people to be reimbursed for work they've done, not requiring a receipt for every screw and nail that was ever purchased. That was a way that we sped things up, not enough, but sped things up somewhat and provided additional flexibility. So I know that he has that personal commitment. And then in terms of, casting the argument in a bipartisan way, then that's probably a cost issue. So maybe asking the GAO to take another look at the cost of not streamlining these programs.
That's interesting. Any other thoughts on kind of what that high-level policy decision looks like on the ground?
I mean, I think one of the things that really needs a strong look at is, I'm all for checks and balances, but there's so much overemphasis on that John Grathwold, you can just nod your head or shake your head. So much money goes into administering these programs that could go to the people, because we're trying to make sure that we don't waste 10 cents and we spend $1 for every 10 cents that we save. I think most people, most New Yorkers, will do the right thing if you give them money. If they have a need, if they truly have a genuine need, and they need the money and you give it to them, they'll build their house back and they'll get back in it. They don't really need that much government help and government oversight. So I think we could make a pretty good argument for starting with some very basic reform to the process, where we trust people that if we're going to help them, they're going to do the right thing with the money. And internationally, there's a big trend now towards stop sending the bags of rice overseas, give them cash. People know what to do with cash. And I think New Yorkers would know what to do with it as well.
I totally agree with Brad.
Marion, let's talk about Katrina for a second.
Oh, Holly. Okay, so after Hurricane Katrina, there actually wasn't a housing recovery program. There was, but it was very, very small. Most people were awarded compensation for economic loss if they were homeowners. So they got the difference between what their home was worth the day before the storm and what it was worth after. The hope was that this would make things move more quickly, 18 months till the first person got a check, but this was the hope, and that would enable people to fully recover. This was fraught with problems, including people spent the money on other things, like new cars and medicine, and gosh, they'd never had $150,000 in cash, so think of some other things they might have spent it on. At a time when people are very, very stressed, it's hard to make these decisions. And there were lots of legitimate costs in their lives that weren't repair. And so what is the goal? What is the goal? Is it to get people totally healthy? Is it to get the community itself back to a new viable place? It goes back to that big question of what are we trying to accomplish? Right. The other thing I would just throw out there before Brad grabs the microphone away from me is we need more tough discussion around when to do individual property level work and when to do community scale mitigation, which you raised also, Holly. I think in New York City, we see that there may be overinvestment in elevation when maybe we should have done more green infrastructure, seawalls, and community scale. Because at the end of the day, it could be more expensive, and the couple of homeowners who get missed, who don't get their home elevated, maybe they didn't have the English proficiency, maybe they didn't have the paperwork proficiency, maybe they weren't legal residents and were afraid about that, I don't know. They're as much at danger as they ever were.
I want to make a quick point to Brad's point about the fear of God that many grantees have about spending a penny with the IG looking over their shoulder. One thing I learned by working with Irene Chang Semino, wherever she is, in 9/11, and with the New Jersey lawyers, like every one of them's a lawyer that had worked for Chris Christie, I think, is you can do amazing things when lawyers write very, very long memos explaining why they're doing things. New Jersey would send us 85, 90-page briefs on every single action they took. Kind of works, so that's just a little secret.
All right, just to follow on thought. So the post-Katrina compensation program could be obviously significantly improved upon. The reason they did that, by the way, one of the main reasons is that if you give people cash for a non-specific purpose, you don't have to go through the same environmental processes, right? So you're not giving it to them to fix their home, because if it's to fix their home, they have to have an environmental assessment done on whether or not it's going to affect whatever may be in the home they've been living in for the last few decades. So if you give it to them with no specific purpose, then why are you surprised that they didn't use it to build their house? You didn't tell them they had to use it for that. So I think that you could have...
They did covenant them that they had to do that. They had to have a fully repaired house by a date certain. They didn't have to use the money.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
But magically their house had to do
So to me, the solution to that is go with the cash and get the CBOs involved. These are the people that know the community, they know the people, they work with them all the time. They'll help the people figure out what to do with their money. And that's what we tried to do at Build It Back. That's probably the one good thing that I did with Build It Back, was to try to get a CBO actually involved in the organization. We need more of that. It needs to be a part of the program.
Well, one of the things I would say is that one of Holly's point is around outreach and communication, not only around what people should expect in terms of timing on the recovery, but what the recovery is, but also trying to engage people who might be historically distrustful of government. But a lot of the government rules, as we've been talking about, betray an essential distrust of residents. So why should they trust the government when the government clearly doesn't trust them? So it's great to be able to unpack that and understand from the Katrina perspective why there is this distrust. But ultimately, when you're told you have to document everything that you've done 5 different times and sign 1,000 things, people might feel like, well, they think I'm actually going to, use this money to go off to the casino or whatever. So it's a really important tension to kind of unpack and try and agree that there's a common purpose, which goes back to the definition of what we mean by recovery. So if we've all decided that it's to get you back in your home, and this is the tool that we're going to use it for, it's easier to communicate around.
Let's open it up to questions. Obviously, a lot of balls in the air. I think that's a great point. I'll just start briefly by saying that I think for major resources, I think that's to the point I made about an infrastructure bill. If we're going to have an infrastructure bill, it should absolutely include requirements for resilient building so that we are protecting any new infrastructure we're building rather than just always retroactively figuring out how to do that after the fact. That's one way that should that go forward, we can get serious money in a non-disaster setting. I think HUD has funding, always being cut, but funding for housing counseling and other not-for-profits I think it would be very helpful to have disaster expertise become a portion of how you would get your housing counseling money, so that that is actually something that's anticipated as something that you would have to have some expertise at. It may mean that some of that funding gets shifted to different not-for-profits, but that may not be the worst thing in the world. It's clear that those groups were essential after Sandy, and I think that should be something where we have resources, we need to always be thinking about preparedness and recovery, in my opinion, in the lens of what can we add to the existing resources, because it's so hard to get new resources. I don't know if there's other thoughts on this.
I think the city and the state are really trying to do that both through leadership and funding. So the One NYC plan has really tried to lay out a framework for that. But you're right, it's about the resources. I think looking to the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities Fund folks, where they're really trying to put some philanthropic dollars into resilience. But the state has deployed a lot of its CDBG funding around resilience. We're working on a project to help folks understand their flood risk called Flood Help NY, which is funded by the state. So I think there are bright spots around that, but maybe it's something going back to some of the low-income housing tax credit priorities, right? You could put something in the QAP. Or there are other ways to kind of institute it in our existing infrastructure, right? We're so siloed, even within our industry. So if there's a way to integrate it across all of the funding, like they've done with green communities, and both enterprise and HPD, I think they're
right. And it's essential that this gets done as part of just the way of doing business at the local and state level too. I think New York State a few years ago passed a law that any capital projects, any planning process, any guidance to municipalities has to include both climate change assessments as well as disaster preparedness. That should just become standard at all levels, and New York City's doing a lot of work on that with their zoning code as well. I think those kinds of things where this just becomes something that is standard part of our thinking on all resources, on all legislation is critical.
And I think while memories definitely fade, as the storm is in the rearview mirror for a lot of folks who weren't directly impacted. I do think that resiliency was probably the word of 2014 when when the task force was really out there and really trying to push for innovation, and I think at the state and local levels as well really caught on. I think we have seen it also institutionalized in a way. Even in the private sector, we see our electric distribution companies in New Jersey, building in resiliency. Obviously, they get a nice return on investment for doing so, but I think it's become much more the forefront of their mind when they're making business decisions. We had 2.8 million ratepayers that were without power, some for 2, 3, 4 weeks. And it's really one of the major impacts of the storm. So I think, particularly on the electric side, resiliency has been institutionalized. We also talked a little bit about preventing. You can't prevent, but trying to mitigate the impacts of storm surge and flooding events. That's a little bit harder. I think it was definitely a big focus on everybody, but we still haven't found the perfect. The silver bullet, so to speak, and it's really expensive. But I think that this storm had a really positive impact in terms of changing the dialogue and really putting resiliency, mitigation at the forefront of everybody's mind.
I think that's right. One of the things on preparedness, I did not get heavily into it in my paper, but there are some case studies in there that I think are really worth looking at, and I cite some reports that have a lot more about things that are happening at local and state levels. Some really cool stuff happening in Texas, where a group of not-for-profits and architects came together and had a design competition for a housing prototype that can basically be immediately put up as temporary housing, but then built upon to become permanent over time. And they have that prototype, and in fact, they are talking to FEMA, I believe, about trying to get that accepted as a FEMA thing. And another thing they do down there is work with a lot of the low-income and immigrant population on something they call pre-covery, which is going out to people who are in at-risk areas in the Rio Grande floodplain and talking to them about what is FEMA, what would you have to do if a disaster hit you, here's the application process, this is these are the resources that come after a disaster, so that they've done some of that outreach work before a disaster even strikes. And there's a lot of other really creative things happening countrywide on preparedness that I think all of us should be getting to our local and state officials as much as we can.
Well, I think the other thing that's interesting that you touched upon is that people are expanding the definition of resilience to not just include physical resilience, but financial resilience. So that allows for a more holistic approach.
Yep, exactly. Are there any more questions from the audience? It's interesting, New York City is maybe unique in having that perspective. Certainly New Jersey and New York State did not look at it that way. FEMA doesn't look at it that way. There is nothing kind of at the federal level that anticipates that federal programs will make people whole. New Jersey's program had a cap, it was income limited, it had a cap on total grants, and there was never an assumption, New York State same, that this was going to make everyone whole. New York City did go that route, which obviously makes for a more complicated and more expensive program. But I think it is an interesting question. Do we want the federal government to make that decision, or do we want to leave it to states and localities to make that decision, which is essentially what's happening now? Other thoughts on that?
I mean, when it comes to housing, it's kind of an all or nothing, right? If people don't have any other resources and they don't have a house, then either you're going to give them the money to do it, or they're not going to have a house. So I don't think, New York City sort of consciously made that decision, Thaddeus. I think there was the implied assumption that there was a lot of money out there and there were people in need, and we were going to try to help as many of them as we could. We did prioritize originally in some income levels because we didn't know how much money there would be for sure. But I think that, if HUD doesn't hand down any rules saying don't make people whole and they give you sufficient funds, then you're going to do as much as you can with the funds that you're given and try and build people the houses back.
But how about requiring a definition, right? Maybe the first step should be that the locality should define what they mean by recovery.
I think that's right. And I think so that, the more an interesting question, Thaddeus, would be, are we trying to make your community whole? And if we are, then we start looking at things like what Jim tried to do in Staten Island and some of the things the city planning people are trying to do to try and really make the community not only whole, but maybe better and more resilient than it was. So we're a combination of doing it at the individual level, household level, and community level.
Yeah, New Jersey, we fortunately didn't have to really tackle that philosophical question of making people whole, because when we got our first allocation, we candidly just didn't have enough money to cover all the unmet need that was out there. And we didn't know what allocations or tranches were coming down the pike. And in fact, when we started our REM program, the primary homeowner program, there was a pretty extensive wait list as a result of that. So we just didn't have the luxury of working without a cap. So that was the practical reality. But I think that building on what Brad just mentioned, there's cascading impacts of a disaster like this. All the different sectors sort of, there's interplay there. So if folks aren't moving back into their community, businesses aren't thriving, municipalities lose their rate base and they can't pay for essential services. So, definitely appreciate the concept of allowing the local communities to be part of that discussion. In New Jersey, we have 565 municipalities. A lot of them were impacted, and I can guarantee you everyone would say, yes, please help our homeowners get back in, because we're not willing to put the close sign up. We need our businesses back, we need our residents back, we need our schools back. So that was really just a practical reality of our situation.
One of the things that makes this extra confusing, I don't envy HUD this because they're the ones that have to sort it out, is after disaster, all the governments start putting forward, these are our needs for recovery, and they give a list of things that they think would help recover, and it adds up to a certain amount of money, and then Congress passes whatever amount of money they think is appropriate, and then HUD has to figure out how to give it out without really telling people exactly what to use it for. So you end up with those situations of, and we had a lot of discussion about that, should we be first taking care of homeowners and then worrying about businesses and then worrying about resilience? Or should we be sort of spreading out across those? And we really didn't do any of them particularly well. because it starts with the fact that Congress didn't tell us exactly, they didn't tell us, we said we needed this amount of money to do these things. They gave a different amount of money, not specific to states, and then HUD has to figure out how to parcel that out in some way that doesn't make everyone completely crazy.
Yeah, and I think
Right.
one of the things Marion and I have talked about is HUD in Sandy announced the allocations to the grantees in 3 tranches over the course of a couple of years. And I think Terry has brought this up to me, that it was very difficult to size programs when you didn't know how much money you were going to end up with. And I think one of the recommendations is really HUD needs to announce what every grantee's allocation is up front, and so that the grantees at least know what they're dealing with. There's enough unpredictability without having that extra level of unpredictability. Another question?
I mean, it is a part of that, broader discussion of what people are entitled to. And I mean, it's whether or not the federal government, the state and local governments have created regulations that give people a sense that they're safer when they may still be at risk, right? So if you're in the 100-year floodplain, that means there's a 1% chance of every year that you'll get flooded. So they're not saying that by buying flood insurance you won't get flooded. They're saying buy flood insurance because there's a 1% chance in every year that you will get flooded. So, that sort of background is that no federal government, no state government, no local government is guaranteeing you that if you build the building code, your house won't collapse, that if you buy flood insurance or elevate your home, that a bigger flood won't come and flood you. So I understand your point, but I think that it's probably asking too much for government to regulate to the point where you'd be 100% safe, because then no one would be able to build anything.
And I also think, obviously, the weather events are becoming more frequent and more intense, and FEMA is constantly on a treadmill to try to update maps, but there's no way we're ever going to have a perfect overlap between Mother Nature and a map. And I think there's just going to be inherent risk that we cannot legislate for, and then the question becomes, can we as a country afford to keep putting tens of billions of dollars every year into this? And so I think these are the exact kind of difficult policy questions.
And on that point, most homeowners who have their home damaged in a presidentially declared disaster aren't getting a grant beyond FEMA. They may make a claim on their flood insurance. There are presidentially declared disasters all over the country. The Sandy grant was actually for that and other major disasters in 2011 through 2013. And there are major disasters declared in 2/3 of the country. 2/3 of the counties in the country had presidentially declared disasters. So we're talking about these issues of fairness, of what's fair for homeowners within the context of a catastrophe that had the most generous allocation of federal dollars compared against the damage in the other disasters. But I just wanted to put that out there, that there are many homeowners all over across the country that aren't going to see a penny more than FEMA given to them.
I think we have time for one more question. Maybe we can get both of you if they're quickies.
I couldn't agree more with that framing of the question, especially when you think about acquisition programs where you're trying to give folks enough funding to move within New York City, and there's really no place to buy an affordable equivalent in New York City for a working family. So what we've struggled with around presumptions around coastal homeowners when talking about flood insurance is everybody thinks you're talking about wealthy people with vacation homes and boats. But in New York City, the majority of folks in the 100-year floodplain are under 80% of AMI. And they're working class people, and they don't really have another community to relocate to within New York City. So when you talk about losing your tax base, when you talk about council people, council members seeing their districts wholly change, when we talk about planned retreat, right? It's a really difficult question, and I do think it's easier to do it in sort of a more stable economic environment, but in New York City, it's just the affordability issues add another level of complexity, and we're already seeing people having to move out of the city for economic reasons, and there's a fundamental change that's happening in our neighborhoods that we have to ask some really difficult questions around. So the more that we can engage people in a global conversation around planning and how we keep New York City affordable both within outside of the recovery and resiliency context is a really important question.
Okay, well, Thank you. I think this has been a fruitful morning. I want to thank my panelists and thank you all for